Are rich people greedy? We're exploring that together here in this third and final video in a three-part series. I'm Keith Weinhold, 20-year real estate investor and active member of the Forbes Real Estate Council. In one of my favorite quotes in all of finance and economics, here is what American economist and academic Thomas Sowell said about greed. This is a masterpiece. Sowell said, "I have never understood why it is greed to want to keep the money you have earned, but not greed to want to take somebody else's money." Wow! I mean, what an astounding mic drop moment for Thomas Sowell. That is just incredibly thought-provoking. But I will answer this. Are rich people greedy? No, not more or less than anyone else, as we've been describing in this three-part series. Hey, go ahead and put a like on this video if you like the topic that we're continuing to take on here. I'm Keith Weinhold. Enjoy the third and final episode of my three-part series with international man Doug Casey. Are rich people greedy?
I think we're going to be living in very rough times in the over the next decade, certainly. But the good news is that individuals are still going to be able to, if you produce more than you consume and wisely set aside the difference, it's still possible to grow rich in the United States. Actually, more than almost any other country in the world.
Yes, perhaps from that perspective, the United States is one of the least worst places for upward mobility. For example, as real estate investors, perhaps sometimes we're resented because some of the tax incentives that we take advantage of can be perceived as loopholes by those that don't understand them. For example, we talk on this show that one advantage of being a real estate investor is that you can endlessly defer your capital gains tax until the day that you die with something called a 1031 exchange. So if someone gets self-educated about this and then goes ahead and does those things, well, the government incentivizes real estate investors for doing that, providing housing that's clean, safe, affordable, and functional. It's not always easy being a landlord. So these sorts of things are incentives to get people to produce, and therefore they build wealth for themselves ethically.
They'd have a lot more capital to build wealth with if there wasn't an income tax to start with. So as long as the income tax is there, you owe it to yourself to minimize the amount of money that you give to the government as much as possible. So I'm all for 1031s from that point of view.
The income tax, sales tax, there's property tax. Oftentimes, 80 cents on one's dollar that they earn is taxed away when you layer all these taxes on top of each other, both federal and state.
With the gigantic deficits that the government is running now, and they're basically monetizing them. I mean, we're running deficits of $1 trillion, $2 trillion per year now. And they're basically being financed by the Federal Reserve printing up money. Despite that, I think they're going to be forced to raise taxes. The only way the government, U.S. government, can survive is either by tax money, extracting it from its subjects, or printing money and paying its bills with money it prints. So I think we're going to see much more inflation and much higher taxes.
What kind of economy do we really live in the United States, Doug? Is it really more of a hybrid of an individualist and a collectivist state today? You know, sometimes that's what I ask myself. For example, and there's perhaps a bit of an irony to this. Back at the beginning of our chat, I mentioned how I started out and became upwardly mobile by making a 3.5% down payment with an FHA loan, a government program, so that I could go then from there serve the free market with housing and pay market price for a building and charge what the market would bear for rents and so on. So, you know, I guess really using that as an example, in my track that I was on, if you want to call that career track a highway, it's sort of this FHA loan, this government program that gave me an off-ramp to upward mobility. So do we live in more of an individualist state or a collectivist state? Or how do you define what America is today, Doug?
In the United States, it's become a melding of large corporations with the government, where one hand washes the other. individual entrepreneurs. The IRS doesn't particularly like individual entrepreneurs. It likes employees that work for a big organization and have their taxes taken out of the paycheck at the source. But wait a minute. The government is hiring 87,000 new IRS agents, and they're mostly going to be interested in going after individual entrepreneurs who don't work for anybody else, who work for themselves. So the corporate state, Mussolini called it fascism, the melding of business and government interests. That's what it is. I mean, fascism doesn't technically have to do with jackboots and black uniforms. That's an accident of fascism. It's an economic system. Yeah, we're going to see a lot more of that and a lot less independent entrepreneurialism in the future. And like I said, it's not talked about almost at all. The fact that in Biden's last economic program called the Inflation Reduction Act,
what a funny name.
$400 billion. Part of it is to finance 87,000 new IRS agents. That's terrifying, actually. Terrifying.
Well, inflation's come down. Of course, that's a result of the Inflation Reduction Act, right? No, not at all.
I'd recommend to all of your listeners right now, okay, you might say to yourself, I'm worried. What should I do? Well, the economy is still held together with chewing gum and baling wire. I would take this opportunity, while we still have something that looks pretty good, to work twice as hard. Take 2 jobs so that you're earning twice as much and necessarily spending less, and put that money aside. But wait, you can't put that money aside in the bank. I mean, the banks themselves are another problem. But you're saving it in dollars, and those dollars are being inflated away at 10% per year. You should buy gold for your savings, but you can also do what you do, and that's look at real estate so that inflation might work in your favor. Although I'm afraid interest rates are going to head up a lot higher in the future, and that could have negative consequences for the real estate market.
We've got an entire generation that doesn't have any idea of what high interest rates are since they peaked in about 1981. An entire generation that thinks things like 7% mortgage rates are high, and history shows even that is below the historic average, of course. Yeah, we like debt on real estate here that we rent to others because effectively our debt is outsourced to tenants. So tenants pay it down, and then inflation debases our debt at the same time, while the asset value is typically benefiting from inflation.
But listen, you were a lot of rents and mortgage payments put on hold, put in abeyance by the government for a period of time. How did that work?
For example, every eviction moratorium and rent freeze I'm aware of across the nation has ended. New York City is the last place where it was still lingering. I guess I haven't read a story that confirmed that it's complete in New York City, but it's largely, if not completely, sunsetted there. Unlike these college loan program freezes, repayment freezes, which just continue and continue and continue.
Do they have to catch up on those payments or not?
Well, the biggest, like the National Loan Forbearance Program, those borrowers got to go ahead and just pay later and just tack payments onto the end of their loan. So it's a beautiful program for them. They do not need to catch up.
I see. It's just tacked on to the end of their loan.
Just tacked on to the end of like a 30-year loan. So if you had make it a 31-year loan if you had 1 year of forbearance, for example. Yeah, pretty sweet program for a borrower there. But
well, why not make it a 100-year loan or, for that matter, a 1,000-year loan?
Do you have any last thoughts on what either society can do for the right policy answers or what an individual can do in this increasing, creeping collectivist state?
My advice, which will not be taken, I promise you, is to radically, and I do mean radically, cut government spending, wholesale abolish many or most of the agencies that are in Washington, D.C. Now, just the opposite is going to happen. Forget about that. Abolish the Federal Reserve and use a commodity as money, like gold, which was day-to-day money until 1933. That's not going to happen. We're going just the opposite direction. Soon we'll, in a matter of months, they'll be pushing what are known as central bank digital currencies, where the dollar, which is bad enough as paper, will start disappearing as paper, and you'll be using strictly digital dollars, which is extremely dangerous.
CBDCs concern people an awful lot, where the government centralizes digital control of a currency they issue, and therefore they could tell a user potentially, hey, here's your monthly universal basic income of $5,000. You better spend it within 30 days. And oh, by the way, your local economy needs more help, so you have to spend at least half of it within a 5-mile radius of your home, or else the money disappears and goes away. It's that type of control that people are concerned with the potential here specter of CBDCs.
Another thing I'd recommend to listeners, although this may be impractical for most, is try to internationalize yourself, because as dangerous as the financial markets are, and they're very dangerous today, they're not nearly as dangerous as the political situation. So just as you might diversify financially, which is prudent, you should diversify politically and get some assets out of your home country into a second country that in case things get bad, the way they did in Russia in 1917 or Germany in 1933 or Cuba in 1959. I can give you lots of examples like that. You've got a nest egg someplace in a different political jurisdiction. I know that may not be practical for most people, but they should think about it and try to make it practical.
The UN recognizes 193 nations in the world, and some real estate investors don't feel adequately diversified if they hold all their real estate in just one nation. So, well, Doug, as we wrap up here, do you have any last thoughts on eat the rich sentiment?
I think a lot of families have found at their recent Thanksgiving dinner that it was impossible to talk about anything other than the weather or sports or the state of the roads. They can't talk about any important issues because the country has become divided into kind of red people and blue people, kind of wokesters and traditionalists. I think it's going to get worse for a lot of reasons before it gets better, because life goes on, everything gets better, hopefully, eventually. Keep these things in mind and don't keep living like a turkey at Thanksgiving. Because, you know, the turkey is around for, a year? And he says, every day I get fed and everything's wonderful and, and then it all comes to an end quickly. So don't be like a turkey and think that just because something is like given away one day, it'll be the same the next day.
This has been really enlightening. Doug Casey, thanks so much for coming back onto the show.